we're in the Bayou Revue office at the University of Houston downtown with my friend, mentor, and novelist Daniel Peña to discuss his new novel, Bang. Thank you so much for doing this. This is really, really exciting.
Thanks for having me. This is awesome.
So we're just to kind of like open it up, just sort of have a conversation. I don't want to frame it too much around questions, but I did have a few questions reading the book, and it's something that's pretty fresh in my mind. I read over it again last night, and I have nothing but good things to say about this novel. It's awesome. It was definitely like an edge of your seat read, set on the border amidst the drug war. Why did you select this location for the novel? Like, what drew you to this particular part of Mexico?
Yeah. So for me, like, northern Mexico is a fascinating place. I mean, it's such a it has so many idiosyncrasies. It's something that's really different from the rest of Mexico, and so but it's also a place where we deport like 80% of people who are deported. And so the book was really sort of the root of it was this question, which was like, where does dignity come from? And essentially, can you blame someone ever for trying to find their own dignity? Mm-hmm. Is dignity a right or is it a privilege? And so in thinking of this, I knew that I didn't want to write the typical deportation story. But what I wanted to do was to give these characters agency so that, one of the brothers was a pilot. Yeah. The other brother was just like really crafty, and they come from this sort of, really scrappy sort of social fabric within their family that, they survive, and that's what they do. And so what happens is they crash an ultralight aircraft over this gray patch of land. It's sort of ambiguous whether it's Mexico or Texas. Mm-hmm. And one brother gets absorbed into a cartel when he goes looking for help. The other brother goes and looks for his father in northern Mexico in a really, it's a fictional town called San Miguel in Chihuahua. And the joke is there's like 7 San Miguels.
Yes.
So like, the most famous being San Miguel de Allende.
Reading that, I thought to myself, oh, I'm so glad that it was a fiction, because I was like 90% sure it was a fictional San Miguel. But it could, I mean, it really...
But it's based on those real towns that are burnt out, that they're dotted all around, Chihuahua and parts of Tamaulipas, but also parts of Coahuila, that are just sort of like run by these sort of autodefensas, that are sort of their own thing.
Absolutely, and that was a part of the book that I found really fascinating. Is we hear so much about the narcos, but a lot of people don't know about the autodefensa groups and how they began maybe with their hearts in the right place. Yeah. And became the very thing that they despised, and that's such a sad cycle for Mexico. Since you mentioned San Miguel being a fictional town, was one of the questions I was going to ask. I know we've talked about Roberto Bolaño and his influence on you, and this was reminiscent of Santa Teresa being kind of analogous for Juarez in his novel 2666. And one of my favorite parts in Bang are the angels that you mentioned, because that is like a really striking image in the book. Did you go to Juarez? Did you visit any of these border towns? Did you, for example, see the angels in real life?
The angels are based on a real sort of protest movement that was happening in Ciudad Juarez. That was like people were dressing up in these sort of like angel-like uniforms that were sort of to draw attention to sort of the heavy death toll there. And so it was just that's sort of one of the things that are really fascinating to me about the fabric of northern Mexico. Is sort of the bathos of just sort of like you can have this like angel in a street corner, and then like a block away he's protesting the guy that was gunned down on the church steps, and it's sort of like, whoa, this sort of everything is sort of I don't know, like I can't explain it, or I can't articulate it. I guess that's what makes it sort of idiosyncratic, and this is sort of a meditation what the book is about. But that sort of latent heaviness within the sort of the mundane within northern Mexico, within places like Matamoros, which is where my mom's side of the family is from, which I've traveled in a lot, and parts of Coahuila and Chihuahua, which I traveled in a lot, like in my 20s. Yeah. And so some of it comes from just seeing things, or we used to go to this one carnival in Coahuila called it was a feria, but it was like the town's sort of a carnival thing. And I remember just like being there, and you knew that it was sort of out that it was a narco town. Yeah. And that like, not that things are heavy, but just like that's the modus operandi of that social fabric, and you have to honor that when you walk in there. And that was something I grew up in Austin, was something that was fascinating to me, and the way in which it's someone who I was like, it must be me who only feels the heaviness here. But then you get to talking to people and like everyone feels it.
Absolutely. And there's so many, I mean, I don't know whether to call them Easter eggs, but almost like cultural Easter eggs throughout the novel, from the bottles of Peña on the counter to the Extremo magazine, which is just like Alarma and all these very it is Alarma, right? And I remember growing up in Mexico City and being so shocked because for many years before I moved to Mexico City, when I was a little boy, we would go for like a month in the summer. So I was pretty much a gringo 90% of the time, and then for that month the shock was really sharp. And I remember a part in the book when the characters, I think it's Uli, who's craving to hear English spoken or to speak English. He's making his lists, which I think is a great idiosyncrasy of his, and that plays an important part in the book.
He's a weird character, I like that.
But seeing that kind of violence on the front page, when American news would go to extreme lengths to not show anything of the kind, that was really shocking. I don't know, there was kind of an honesty to it though. And I think the photographer character was also fascinating for that reason.
Ivan,
so as a Hispanic writer and being bilingual, I mean, did you feel compelled to write a book on such a Hispanic subject? I mean, did you always know that this was going to be the themes and content for your first novel?
Well, that's a great question. I knew I wanted to write a novel about the drug war in Mexico after just having, I'd gone a lot. And so it was one of these big questions, just sort of like, what is this about? I had no idea, I had no context for it when I was younger. And so it was something that was on my mind. Not to get too much into it, but, even I think everyone has a family member, if you have family in Mexico, that's been caught up in something there.
Absolutely.
And so for me, it was really important to sort of just look that in the eye, but then also sort of like, I think there's so much, it's possible to sort of grow numb to that trauma if you're just hitting it with sort of like the one sort of note all the time. It's death, which is kind of like Alarma, and that's Ivan, and the sort of like, the Nota Roja, and it's sensationalist. But what I was fascinating to me about Nota Roja is that it is also like wildly funny. At times it can be like silly, and it's like that sort of that sort of pivot, what Charles Dickens would call streaky bacon, which is mixing the tragic with the absurd, or mixing funny with sad, or mixing that pathos, that extreme change was something that was like really, I was trying to sort of get the texture of really, and I don't want to call it a Mexican moment because there are many Mexicos, right? Yes. Ciudad de Mexico is really different than Chihuahua.
Absolutely.
But that sort of latent heaviness that is sort of present in those towns that are like, not unlike, San Miguel, the fictional San Miguel, which you would find in really like, Matamoros, I would say, Sabinas for sure, parts of Coahuila. And so, or even parts of Guerrero. I think it's I can't explain it. There's a heaviness, but there's also sort of life continues on there, and life is funny, and kids are playing the street, and people live there.
I think that you really do a good job of depicting the narcos realistically, and because they have become caricatures in so many works of fiction and films. And then you've got a character like Lalo, who I think the line is something like he's more silly than scary, and he does seem like kind of good-natured, sort of flamboyant, obviously cares about his daughter, and yet doesn't think twice about doing terrible things, or putting he's just like, we meet him, he's just looking for a body for a gladiator fight, pitting men against each other for sport. So that kind of contradiction is really interesting, and I think it kind of touches on the same vein. You could have it's a good tragic comedy of a lot of Latin America, but I really think that the narco war, like all wars, is really complex, and that complexity is really beautifully captured.
And it's about markets, right? I think that's something that sort of gets lost sight of, that I was really trying to explore with Bang, is that markets, you can't fight a market problem with a military solution, if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
Like, I think that's the way that sort of through the Mérida initiative, through this sort of Calderón and Peña Nieto's escalation of that war, you saw 175,000 people killed, 20,000 plus people disappeared. And really all it's about is, and it's sort of like going to that with Lalo, that character, and with NAFTA and that kind of idea that if a system fails you, you create your own system, and these are systems, even black markets are systems through which people sort of earn dignity, gain dignity. But yeah, Lalo, I'm also just I'm a huge fan of just lovable fuck ups. Like Ivan is a lovable.
Yeah.
He's kind of a pervert. But it's sort of also it's kind of soft, he was
kind of this sheltered mama's boy, but who ends up really falling into this profession completely by accident, and I love that he's kind of being hailed as this aesthete. He's got an aesthetic, but it's really just a shitty camera.
He's got a shitty camera, the light leaks in. Yeah,
but that's great, and that is an aesthetic. I guess he might not see it that way, but he's. And then I also
read this book really closely.
I really think there was it was really a compelling read, because the characters felt real, and knowing Mexico intimately, I've always heard my mother would say nuestro pobre país, like our poor country, every time something terrible would come across the news, which was basically every day, and it has escalated so much really since I moved here in 2004. I mean, it's become a full-blown war in many ways, but it is business and it is marketing, but there's also the cultural aspect that you touch upon, where in some of these communities the narcos do more for the actual people than the government.
I mean, that was Chapo. It was this idea, there's a Robin Hood, you steal. I mean, the whole cult behind Jesus Malverde, is it's like a Robin Hood situation.
Absolutely.
It's really complex. It's not as cut and dry. People say, people get really bent out of shape about having these sort of morality questions, right? Or this black and white. If a person has honor, would they really kill people, or would they really be in the drug business? And we never ask those questions of ourselves, those of us involved in sort of the legal markets, right? There's a big question about whether the violence that we perpetrate on, or perpetuate rather, on the most vulnerable people in Mexico, but also in America. We have an epidemic here too, a drug crisis. Whether that is part of the same kind of fabric of violence that is committed on people by cartels, right?
Yeah. I think that my favorite characters is a real toss-up between Lalo and June, who I see as opposites in a lot of ways, because June is determined and self-sufficient, this kind of punk rock chick who's she's visibly scarred and also internally scarred by her experiences being caught up in this war, and I'm definitely gonna steer away from giving anything away, because I recommend everybody who hasn't read this book get a copy and read it, because it is a gripping ride. But there are two scenes that I'm gonna out of context mention that really stuck with me, and they both had a kind of nightmarish, dreamlike, surreal quality. And one is a horse burning, and the other one is a wall collapsing filled with tiny skeletons. Where did those scenes come from? And I don't want to put them in context of the story, because it might give something away. But I mean, there was something so quintessentially Mexican about that. Mexico, where we have a relationship with the dead, even a holiday celebrating the dead, and the relationship to death with Mexicans is different than any other culture I've known of, even other Latin American cultures. So those two scenes that were heavy. Nightmarish scenes. Where did they come from? What inspired them?
No, this is a great question. The Bernie Mare was something, and I feel like this is sort of, we were talking about this earlier with Wolfgang Hilbig, Old Rendering Plan, that book, but how this, I feel like that trope of sort of the idea of decay coming from, being part of the very earth in which we grow out of, that's really latent in Mexican culture too, and it's really salient within Mexican culture, at least the Mexican culture that the fabric that my family comes from. And so the Bernie mare for me was just this grotesque image of this mare that was sort of burned through the middle, right? Just burned through the middle of it, and was sort of a symbol for sort of that chapter. But we always talk about death coming in on a white horse and that kind of thing. And so I don't want to give too much of it away, but it was sort of bringing in all these tropes about decay and rebirth, and the idea that even the most painful chapters that we think we've buried, they're always sort of salient within the present moment. You never can really escape yourself. As much as we like to think of ourselves in the American fabric as individuals, we can shape our own destiny. To some extent, we can. We all belong to some ecosystem, right? And so the Burning Mare was really about that. That symbol was about that. The other one was June, the skeletons.
Yeah.
The skeletons, that's actually a true story.
That's a true story. That is incredible.
Yeah, where there was this church in San Antonio that they were renovating it. It was actually my abuelita went to that church. I will not say which church it was.
Oh my God.
Catholic church. But it's an old church that they had this wall brace on it. Mm-hmm. And when they were going to take the wall down, sort of open it up, open floor plan situation, they pulled it down, and there were all these skeletons in there. Mm-hmm. And they were like babies. Some of them were preserved so well that the skin was still over the bones. It was like obviously really dried and desiccant, but they were still there, and it was like from way back. I'm talking like, colonial times. And it was fascinating to think they got preserved in sort of the adobe of the wall that way. But sort of the consensus about what happened was that the church was sort of like, if a nun or a priest or someone, they needed to get rid of a baby. Mm-hmm. In sort of that time, they literally buried it. They didn't bury it in the ground, but they put it in the wall of something they thought would never come down.
That image of something so hideous hiding in plain view in the place you least expect it, in a place that's supposed to be a sanctuary. I think that also really worked with the book, with the characters that are basically put in situations that question their own morality. You talked a lot about radical empathy. How does that how was that in your mind approaching these characters and approaching the writing of this book?
That's a great question. I mean, for me, it's so important, like going back to the idea of where does dignity come from, to sort of continually ask that question as characters who are sort of, they're not just characters, they're their own living, breathing, but like, they are to some extent representations of sort of characters within the social fabric. And the way in which, I think for me, radical empathy, and it is sort of in the way I approach characters and the way I'm thinking about characters, is really, it's important to think about, people that way, and it's sort of the characters that are stand-ins in that, these things that we take for granted, that we say, oh, everyone is born with certain unalienable rights, right, here in the United States, or that everyone is sort of given, a certain modicum of dignity when they're born, or everyone should, that's not always the case. I think it's a polite fiction we tell ourselves. And for me, radical empathy, while it sounds sort of like a fluffy sort of like, oh, it's really sort of a call to action to look at the dark too, which I think is what some people may bristle at in this book, is that, I think one of the critiques I've had was like, why is it so dark? Mm-hmm. Why is it, why is it not as uplifting? And the question I would really ask is like, why can't you look it in the eye? Why is it that this makes you uncomfortable? And if you can't look it in the eye, if you can't have that radical empathy to sort of access that humanity yourself, and I think ultimately there are two things people fear in this world, and really one of them is, the truth. Yes. And the truth more in the post-truth era, right? And the radical truth, which is linked to radical empathy. But then also their own power, if that makes any sense. Like the power of like their own agency in this world. If you look the truth in the eye and you know that there's some small change you can make in this world, and you don't do that, to look that truth in the eye is to acknowledge your own cowardice, and to acknowledge your own sort of apathy. And I think that's something that radical empathy is. It sounds like really sort of fluffy, or really sort of like sound bitty or something, but it's really it's important to look at the dark.
Definitely, it makes me think again of Alarma compared to or Extremo as it's written in the book, compared to like an American news outlet where we have school shootings or something, and the images that we see are of caution tapes fluttering in the wind, and that there's a disconnect between what actually happened and. We're getting sound bites and talking heads. And in Mexico, although it is sensationalist, boom, they're going to show you a bullet-riddled body.
It's important. That's
it's important.
That's
to see
part
that.
of maintaining your humanity.
I think so.
Like I read this thing. I just saw this the other day. That school shooting that happened down in Santa Fe, just southeast of Houston.
Yeah.
They just had a drive for donations for like AR-15s and stuff, which is like, talk about post-truth or just like bearing, or like not. It's like, wow, literally the similar type of weapon, I think, that these kids were gunned down with. Now they're asking for donations. And I can't imagine being a student in that school or being a teacher and knowing that you almost lost your life or your friends did lose their lives, and then those same kinds of weapons are coming in, and they're like, oh, but it's for the good guys. And I feel like that idea of like, it's really sort of part of the same fabric of this book of like not looking that darkness in the eye and saying, what is this about? And for, whatever you think on guns, we can sort of say, more guns or more deaths, And I think it's fascinating. I'm fascinated with the way that's sort of trickling in this post-truth era.
I mean, one of the fathers of one of the student survivors in the Florida shooting was just killed at his gas station. He owned a convenience store, and he was killed in a robbery. Totally randomly. I mean, they'd already robbed the gas station, he left, and then they just came back in and shot him. And it's just some days it feels like the world's gone insane,
Yeah.
But I think that maybe these are a lot of the dark truths that people in other parts of the world live with daily, but we've been sheltered from, and now they're creeping in.
I mean, this is like Aminata Forna in her book Happiness says this, where she has this character who sort of gives a speech at the end who talks about, we're always, in the Western world, always trying to shield ourselves from trauma. And, and what are the ways that we can sort of mitigate trauma in our lives? But she's like, has it occurred to anybody that, that feeling trauma or acknowledging that trauma and looking that trauma in the eye can make you more human. We look at sort of the caravans of people coming in from, the Via Crucis in Mexico, or we look at, sort of these people coming to our borders and saying, oh, well, they're troubled people, quote unquote troubled people. But like, wouldn't that make them more human, right?
Yeah,
they have more experience. They have more life. They have a deeper, literally a deeper experience of what it means to be human. And I think most of the world has these sort of, I don't know, what would you say, like, that depth in a way that we try to shield ourselves from. And I think this is sort of a critique of American literature at large. I am American and I'm part of that canon, but it's like, we're so polite. We need to feel good at the end of the day. And I get it. Like, a lot of it's about selling units. Right. And you got to make, you want to feel good to read, and you want to have some sort of redemption. Like, that darkness, right? That sort of impolite truth is the stuff that's going to, I think, move humanity,
I couldn't agree more. It's so different, it's why, like, we watched a Swedish film the other night, and it was kind of like your typical killer, police chasing down the killer story that it's so ubiquitous in American culture. But in this film, I mean, it was multi-layered and complex. You sympathize somewhat with the killer. The cops chasing them down have their own demons, and at the end, it's not all resolved and neatly.
Criminals are people too.
Exactly. It was. I just feel that there's other literary traditions don't have the same weight put on them, or the same pressure to tie it all up with a neat little bow. Yeah. And Bang is a book that I think is daring in the sense that it doesn't. How can you tie up the drug war in a tiny little bow? So I feel that the criticisms that people it had, like, why is it so negative? I mean, that kind of brought me to my last question. Looking at the drug war, yes, you do paint a grim portrait, but is there hope? I mean, in your opinion, I felt like there was hope in Bang, however grim that portrait might be. Do you feel that this drug war could be resolved in our lifetimes? Does that possibility exist, or what do you think the future looks like?
I have two answers for that. I think that one is sort of a more technocratic answer, and the other one is sort of a broader answer, which is that, like, knowing that it's a market, and these are markets that have historically moved around. We go to Colombia, that market bounced off to the Caribbean, then subsequently bounced off to Mexico. There will be it'll bounce off somewhere else, and that black market will sort of thrive somewhere else. And so I think will there be an end to the Mexican drug war anytime soon? I couldn't tell you, but will it happen? Yeah, for sure. I think it will. There will be another market. Although Mexico does have that sort of geographic sort of disadvantage of being right next to the biggest consumer, and weirdly enough, or serendipitously enough, the United States, Mexico also has proximity to sort of the biggest supplier of guns to the drug war. I think 80% of all drugs in the gun war come from Texas, which is bananas.
Yeah, there's this shooting gallery right here in Southwest. It's I forget what it's called, but I remember seeing them in the paper, and I pass it all the time when I'm coming down I-10, and they were on the paper because a bunch of their guns were found in Mexico, tied up to this big narco ring. Yeah. They pay guys to come up here because it's like you say, it's a trade-off. We give our guns, they give us drugs, and drugs and guns just whipping back and forth.
I mean, we talk about just black markets, but like there are legal markets that are profiting off this as well.
I think in this specific case, and I'm trying to remember the name of this particular gun store. I don't know if there's like a specific name for them, but they were all legally purchased. And then made their way
sold.
Sold.
I mean, that's. I mean, this is sort of a wrinkle in this question of hope, which is, I think as long as there's money to be made off it, and I don't mean that in a cynical way, but I mean that in a sort of looking the truth in the eye. If there's money to be made off of the drug war, whether it be through increased border security or construction of a fence or gun sales, I think there will always be. We are invested in the merit. I mean, I think, and this is sort of a big question of the book. How invested is America really in ending a drug war that is fueling with guns and bodies, like disposable bodies that we send there to then be absorbed in this cartel? And I think there are black markets, but there are very much non-black markets that are thriving on this.
Right.
And so, is there hope? I think, I'm not a believer that the market will correct political or socioeconomic problems. I just don't think there's been very little evidence to show that. But I do think there is hope. You got to believe,
Absolutely.
You gotta believe.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So we were talking a little bit before shooting about how your novel was structured in a way that it bounced from character to character, but moved the story along through these characters that are unaware of each other's location and yet connected. How did you plan that out? Did you know how the book was going to end from the beginning, or was it something you discovered as you wrote?
Yeah, I think in the very beginning, the only thing I knew was that there was going to be some sort of event that would be sort of an implosion of the social fabric of this book. And so, like, that was all I knew in the beginning. But not writing novels is one of these weird things where you're writing and all you can kind of see in front of you is just sort of like the 10 or 15 feet in front of you, and you're just kind of wandering like that. And so over, I think this novel took, I'm not even joking, like 12 or 15 drafts of just trying to find out. And I remember it was less that I knew what was going on as I was writing it, then I wrote like a bunch of pages, a bunch of subjectivities, a bunch of point of views, characters, and then I tried to find out, like, okay, what is the story here? What is going on here? And then in the last drafts, I was really just shaping it, and I was thinking, like, how is it that, we get from here to here, here to here? And in your mind, someone asked me, like I just told you about my earlier about another piece I was working on in the novel. You can kind of have the rough sketch in your head, but there's always that joke. Is like, have you seen that meme where it's like the novel you're working on versus the novel you have in your head with the Pikachu?
Yeah, it's kind of like the Pikachu Peña.
Yeah,
I was just kind of like wilted. I could relate to that.
Yeah, no, it's.
Oh, I'm sorry.
But it's
out of frame.
Yeah, totally fine. No, but it's like it was like that, and so I was trying to get I had the idea of like the Pikachu, the piñata in my head, and I was trying to sort of get close to sort of a simulacrum of that. And so I always had it was weird. I always had the idea of what it should look like, but then there was the reality of the characters. I think too, like, this is something that I try to tell a lot of my students, but also any aspiring writer out there, that the characters, whether we want to believe it or not, are like living, breathing. They should be living, breathing people with their own agencies and their own desires. And it would happen. This is gonna sound like really oogie boogie. It would happen that like I would be writing a scene. I'm like, would Yvonne do that? And then sure enough, you would find out that he doesn't. And I can't explain. It's sort of like the oogie boogie of writing, but characters have a weird way of making things happen in the narrative that you wouldn't otherwise intend for them to happen.
I think I really felt that these characters felt real and familiar, and I think that's a great testament to your writing. I enjoyed it so much. I really appreciate this, and can't tell you how much I look forward to reading all of your future work. Thanks so much, Professor.
I appreciate you, man. Yeah.
Thank you for watching this special episode of the Refined Outlaw Review. Please click below to subscribe.